Good morning, pre-grammar students. Today we are going to begin our new picture study with a new painter. So we have been studying Turner for a while, and now we're going to move to another country. Turner was English, our new painter is French, and he is considered sort of the most pivotal painter of a movement in painting that happened in the 19th century called Impressionism. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about him first. He was, in fact, very inspired by Turner in his painting, and his name is Monet. Now, before we go on to Monet, I just want to explain something to you that I wish had been explained to me when I was a kid, and it's something that's very confusing. Basically, there are two painters from the same time period, from the same place, if you can imagine, and their names are Monet and Manet. So I even wrote them down for you here so you can see how similar their names are. And you can imagine that this is very confusing. So we are going to be studying Monet, but one way that you can tell them apart, and this is something I learned from a friend, is that Manet was a painter who mostly painted people for the most part. And so you can see man is even in his name, man, Monet. And we actually looked at a Monet painting earlier this year for a story prompt. I don't know if any of you remember this painting of the Gypsies, but this was a painting by Monet. And so you can see people, man, Monet, okay? Now, Monet, who is our painter, he did paint people somewhat, but for the most part, he tended to paint things outside, landscapes, flowers, that kind of thing. So here is a picture of him. This is Monet, and he was born in 1840. He was the son of a grocer. Some of you remember that Turner was the son of a barber. Well, Monet has sort of humble beginnings as well. His father runs a grocery store in Paris. So he's born in Paris, and when he was about 5 years old, his family moved to the coast. So I'll show you on a map here of France. Here is Paris. This is France. And where they moved was to a little town called Le Havre, and it's right here on the coast. So Monet, as a little boy, would watch a lot of the ships that would pass through this area called the English Channel, because this is England up here, of course, and this is France down here. And this English Channel is heavily trafficked. Any of you who've studied a lot of history will learn that there's always sort of invasions going up into England and somewhat through this area here by the Romans and then later the Normans and so on. Anyway, so this whole area is called the English Channel, and it was a lot of shipping that would go back and forth between England and France. And so because Le Havre was a shipping town, Monet would spend his time watching the boats. The other thing Monet liked to do was his father wanted him to take over his grocery business. So he spent a lot of time in the grocery store that his father ran as a child. But rather than learning the tricks of the trade, he spent most of his time drawing comic caricatures of the people that would come into the grocery store. So I have some pictures here to show you these. Let's see if I can point correctly. It's hard to orient myself with this camera. Over here are little caricatures that Monet would do, little funny sketches of people who would come into the store that were kind of comic. So anyway, he grew up, and his mother died when he was about 16, and his father was not happy with the fact that he wanted to be a painter. And in fact, he said to Monet, when Monet was a young man, "What? How will you feed yourself? One must have money. Be sensible, son. A grocer always has food on his table, and it is a dependable profession. Put down your charcoals and listen to reason." Okay. Now, Claude's mother had been very supportive of his decision. And when she died, when he was 16, he finally managed to convince his father to let him be under the tutelage of a man named Eugene Boudin. And under this man's tutelage, Monet began to paint outdoors quite a bit. Now, this was a newer thing as well. When Monet was a young man, before that, most painting was done indoors. This was because painters had to mix their paints in a studio. It was cumbersome. It required a lot of equipment and various jars and things like this. And so people didn't really paint outdoors very often. They would great painters would go sketch outside. They would sort of go make drawings, and then they would bring those drawings into their studio and complete them there. Well, there was a very new invention that happened when Monet was a young man that facilitated this ability to paint outdoors, and that was the invention of pre-mixed oil paints. So suddenly you could buy these little pre-mixed tubes that would come in these little tubes, and they could manufacture these and mass produce them and make them available to people. And so people could put these little tubes in a little box, and they would take their paints and they would go paint outdoors. And so they were able to sort of recreate what they saw out of doors in a much more realistic fashion. And this style of painting became known as en plein air. And I've written it here for you. It's a French term. Monet was French. And the French really embraced this style of painting, en plein air. And it means in the open air, or sort of just outside even. So this is sort of what makes Monet fall in love with painting, this painting outdoors, being in the great outdoors. And it is what makes him eventually a pivotal painter in what's called Impressionism. And so Impressionism, I think maybe Mrs. Time went over some of this with you when I was out, but just to recap, the camera had been invented in the early 1800s. And what the camera did and photography did was it sort of revolutionized people's ability to capture an image of people and of places. And so suddenly painters who up until that point had been the only people who could make an image of someone that would look just like them, or paint a building that would look just like a building, suddenly they weren't needed anymore in the same urgent way to recreate and reproduce what we saw in reality in a realistic manner, because a photograph could do it much more realistically. If any of you have seen a photograph of someone versus a painting of someone, you will see how much more often the photograph really looks exactly what the person looks like in front of us. And so as photography became more available, painting took a shift to, instead of focusing more on how realistically can I recreate this thing, it became how much more can I give you the impression of what I'm seeing, the experience of what I'm seeing, because often the way we experience things in reality is not so much like a photograph. A photograph might look just like a person, but when somebody runs by us, or we see them turn and look at something and we catch their gaze for a moment, we get an impression of that person. Or when we look at a field with the sunlight falling on it, what the camera captures doesn't always quite capture the experience we have of that. And so these painters who wanted to capture the experience of what they were seeing began to call their paintings impressionist paintings, because they gave the impression rather than this exact photocopied reality of what they were seeing. So that's where we're going to wrap up for today. We'll read more about Monet later, but I'm going to end with looking at one Monet painting today. And this is a painting that he did in Paris. And I will tell you what it is after we look at it for a minute. So I'm going to hold it up to the screen. I wish we could be doing this in the classroom, but we'll have to make the best of it. So here we go. I'm going to try and get that up there so that you can see it. You can look at it for a few minutes as I talk about it. Just take it in. So this painting was made in 1877. You can actually see, I should have let you see this first. Down here, Monet has put the date and his name on it, 1877, Claude Monet, 77. And in this painting, we are in a train station. It's called The Arrival of the Normandy Train. Normandy is sort of the northern part of France, and this is a train station in Paris, where Monet, along with other members of sort of his impressionist group of painters, including even Manet, would come and paint this train station. And this was a very popular subject for young painters because, as some of you will remember, passenger railroads were very, very new at this time. They'd only been around for about 30 years. And so not only were they exciting and new, but they also were a splendid topic for painting because, as you can see, they have all this steam that rises up as the train comes in. It releases this burst of steam as the brakes are put on and the train's grinding to a halt, and it makes for a great effect, right? Sorry about the glare. I have a glare there on my window. And you can see sort of the glass of the roof here, the glass roof of the train station that has to be, covered to allow for passengers to board on and off the trains and not get wet, but it needs to let the light in so it's not too dark. And this would have been just a really incredible scene to young Monet. I guess he would have been about 37 when he painted this. So anyway, we'll leave you with this painting. It's called The Arrival of the Normandy Train, Gare Saint-Lazare. So I hope I pronounced that right. I probably didn't. And I will try and send a link of this to your parents so that if you want to study it more online, you can. All right. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.